Okay, thank you very much, Niels Christian, and thank you for showing up. I have been looking forward to this symposium. In fact, this is what I want to discuss, neuroscience of religion. 2 days ago, before and after I did my presentation, we had two neuroscience-heavy presentations by Dr. Lisa Miller and Andrew Newberg. And I think it is important for us as consumers of neuroscience of religion to know a bit about what it is, also some of the methodological problems that exist in the field, how neuroscience may be a different discipline from neurotheology, as Andrew Newberg is practicing, different approaches to how to study the relationship between the brain and religion. There are ways of doing it, and they all seem to have unique affordances, but they also seem to have unique weaknesses. Do you want to listen to this? Brain science. You can say, this is not, I'm not interested. Okay. Let me begin just by asking, for example, what exactly is neuroscience of religion? And because there are many books and there are many courses, there are many papers that refer to the brain to explain religion. There's a deep interest. I don't know if it's a universal trait in humans, but for some reason we are endlessly fascinated with the brain. We just need to stick a picture of the brain on some paper and everybody listens. And so it's attractive to put the image of the brain onto a book and say, now I'm going to talk about something, spirituality. And immediately there's a link that we are excited about. But neuroscience of religion, we might want to narrow it a bit, I think. It could be beneficial to say, for example, that methodologically, neuroscience of religion is the use of neuroscientific technologies, such as neuroimaging, fMRI, MRI, MEG, EEG, all these different ways of measuring brain function and also structural profiles of brains. So we can even stimulate the brain now with transcranial magnetic stimulation. There are many ways, but let's say that methodologically, that's where we are. You cannot study the brain by studying reaction time. I understand that reaction time in a psychological experiment must relate to the brain, but then it's not neuroscience of religion unless you somehow use the empirical methodologies in neuroscience. It's just a suggestion how we could sort of narrow it down a bit, because otherwise there will be a lot of confusion. Theoretically, maybe we could also narrow it a bit, so we don't say, for example, that I have an evolutionary theory about spirituality, and it's so it has to be also involving the development of the brain and the evolution of the brain. That's also clearly true, but it's not neuroscience of religion as such. It's an evolutionary argument, maybe, if you're interested in that. If you're interested in psychology, identity, all kinds of theoretical disciplines, they can always refer to the brain, but it doesn't make it neuroscience of religion. Neuroscience religion may be more narrow, like theories that are primarily founded on what we know about brain function and how neural encoding works, principles that we are familiar with in brain anatomy. So just to narrow the field a bit, that's what I mean by neuroscience of religion. Neuroscience is also different from what is called neurotheology. In neurotheology, the aim is not to make a standard, to look at religious phenomena and explain it from what we know about the brain. Typically, in neurotheological efforts, you're trying to understand how there might be something unique about the brain, something that other neuroscientists have not identified yet. They want, and clearly it's out of an interest. If you have had the experience that spiritual insight is a unique phenomenon, you want to find out how it works in the brain. So you're looking for equally unique models to explain that phenomenon. And it's a fascinating field to look at how there might be unique things happening in the parietal lobe. There might be unique things happening in the prefrontal cortex that other fields in neuroscience they don't know about. But you can make your models based on whatever you like. Typically, there's not any good use of non-conventional brain science. And almost by logic, if you believe that spirituality is a category on its own, maybe you know this concept sui generis, then you need a unique model to explain it. But it's not neuroscience of religion. It's neurotheology, and you're looking for some way to link the divine with the physiological brain. And I deeply respect that. But maybe it's not helpful if we want to have a neuroscience of religion. Let's for a moment park those efforts a bit and see what can we say just out of conventional brain science. If we just use non-controversial models, how can we describe religious phenomena like thought and behavior? You know, beliefs in God, the felt presence of God, when people do rituals, mystical states, all that thing. These models that we find in neuroscience of religion, who adopt a non-controversial approach to the brain, they tend to not be very sensational. They are not able to sell a lot of books because they are not bold in their interpretations. They just describe how religious thought and behavior seems to fit with the standard models we have about brain function. So it's not so exciting, and I'm sorry for that. It might be a disappointment, but we don't. It's almost a consequence of taking a standard approach to the brain that the interpretations will be a bit boring. Now, the field in the neuroscience of religion is fragmented. So that's another, maybe it's a challenge. I come from the humanities originally. I have had psychology, and I spent many years understanding neuroscience. I did my PhD at the hospital in Aarhus in Denmark, and I've taken a lot of time to understand how the brain works. I still don't understand how the brain works, but I understand it a bit. But other people come from different disciplines. There are psychologists, there are social scientists, there are a lot of doctors and psychiatrists who, for some reason, fancy spirituality and and they have the opportunity to go down to the basement and make their scans. It's kind of convenient. So often you find a very strange group of people coming from different disciplines, and they each come with their different agendas. Some of them, they are deeply spiritual and they want to discover how God looks in the brain. Other people, they come from other fields with completely other agendas. So there's a fragmentation. There are commercial interests. Some people just want the evidence so they can promote a particular idea and maybe sell a particular book. But we have a problem as a field, neuroscience of religion, because people don't belong to the same research tradition. I have been editor in one of the leading journals of this link. It's called the Journal for the Religion, Brain and Behavior. And we very rarely received neuroscience papers. They were typically sent into, psychiatric journals or other neuroscience journals or psychology journals, whatever was part of that particular researcher's interest. So it has been quite a challenge to have a field called neuroscience of religion because it's so fragmented. There are different ways that I will spend my time on now to explain what neuroscientific approaches to religion might look like, because they are not so coherent, and it's definitely related to the fragmentation of the field. There are people out there, they are typically psychologists. They think that maybe religion have consequences for the way we cognize. So they adopt standard experimental psychological procedures, like the Stroop task that we've heard about, and see how religious people respond to these. Maybe you adopt or adapt the experimental paradigm a bit so that you can study religious symbols maybe instead of other kinds of symbols. Another I will give you an example in a moment, so don't worry about it. Another approach is to look at structural brain images where you see actual structural differences in the brain. Maybe between groups, you can have a group of religious people and look for how their brains look different from another group, and and try to make some interpretations on that. You can also study religion by analogy. For example, if you believe that altered states or visions, hearing God, all these things, that they are like something else, maybe to hear God is to hallucinate. Maybe there might be an overlap from what you see in hypnosis research, maybe an overlap with illusion research. And so instead of going directly to religion, you might just study the phenomenon of hallucination, and then get wiser and smarter on what it means when people see God by analogy, right? So you use hypnotic models of hypnosis and hallucinations as a model for religious experiences. So that's why I call it by analogy. The fourth approach is to go directly to the religious practice, and that might be the most interesting. So I have, for example, studied what happens in the brains of religious people when they pray to God. I've also studied what happens in the brains when people receive intercessory prayer. I have also studied what happens when people are told that there's a device that gives them added control of their performance. I've studied many things, and it's kind of interesting to go directly to study the authentic religious experience, if it is possible, in a scanner. I think it was Andrew or someone who says that it's not that easy to know if it's an authentic experience when they're lying in the scanner with 110 decibels of noise around them and these things, and anxiety. But insofar it is possible, you could in principle go and have a direct measurement of what is going on in people when they have religious experiences. And people are trying to do so, and I have tried to do so myself. A final approach that I will mention is kind of weird. I'm not going to spend so much time on it, but there's a growing idea out there that the fact that we trust neuroscience and look at brain images, that opens up for a lot of things. So maybe you can create quite extraordinary experiences by saying that they are now in the hands of neuroscientists. We can stimulate your brain to have altered experiences. We can stimulate your brain to feel God. It seems to be a very effective suggestive tool for these experiences. So methodologically, it is something that is occurring. I have experimented with it myself. It's a very interesting phenomenon. And another guy from McGill University, Amir Raz, he's a professor in hypnosis. He calls this phenomenon neuroenchantment. We are enchanted by the brain, and it gives us a lot of opportunities to study phenomena otherwise impossible. So just coming back a bit to the standard experimental psychology of religion, or experimental psychology on religion. I'm not going to go through any particular study. It will take too long. We can talk about it if there's time. But I will just point to the strengths and the weaknesses. In this, this is a study by Inslecht and Tollett. It's a kind of a standard procedure. They have a group difference set up, and they expose the participants to a Stroop task, and they see that religious people, they don't respond to errors to the same extent as non-religious people. That's a very interesting idea, and you can start to think about why that's the case, if it's a robust result. Replication studies are not so optimistic, but maybe we just need more research. But the interesting thing here is that when you go about it this way, adopting experimental psychology comes with a lot of strengths because they have been validated many times. And they typically tend to avoid demand characteristics. They are very well designed. People are not even aware that they're being studied, that their religion is being studied. And we know that as soon as you know what the study is about, we change our behavior. So you want to get rid of demand characteristics in experiments. And experimental paradigms, they're pretty good at that. So you don't have the desirability effects either. You know, we have many problems in psychology, experimental psychology. We know that participants who knows what the study is about change behavior. They even try to please the researcher, right? And if they know that their religion is at stake, they will do whatever they can to defend their position. You know, so it's endless. That is why experimental paradigms, they're good at getting rid of all the demand characteristics. So in fact, the participant will not know what the study is about. Then it's perfect. But if the participant doesn't know what the study is about, there's also kind of a weakness in that, right? There's a complete lack of authenticity, for example. If you want to study religion in people who don't know that they're being religious, how can that be authentic religious cognition? And there's a lack of meaningful experience in those, because they're not allowed, the experience is not allowed to have an effect. So you try to get rid of this, the experiential part, and just study subconscious effects typically. And there's a lack of cultural specificity as well. Typically the psychologists who use this approach, they want to be able to generalize to big populations, so they can claim that they have found something with a societal impact. And it means that they are not so sensitive to cultural specificity, but religious experiences are deeply specific. They're individual. They are specific to each cultural tradition. It's very difficult to just say, now we've studied this in X amount of participants, and we find this as a general rule, for example, in Inslecht and Tollett. With structural brain research, there are other strengths and there are other weaknesses as well, and that's how it is. It's very nice to study how the brain actually is different when you look at the brain. So anatomical differences, they tend to be very robust and much more robust than neural activations in a kind of activity paradigm. The studies that use structural differences, they also tend to have a very high number of participants, but that is because the studies are not typically intended for studying religion or spirituality. Typically, it's a side interest. There are no projects with the money to study, to design a structural imaging study for the sole purpose of studying spirituality. So in most of the structural imaging studies on spirituality, it's because there's a researcher who got involved with a big project and asked, could we please put this spirituality scale in there somewhere? And then they can publish on how spirituality might be different or give different structural results. So why it has a very high number, which is a strength. So because you find robust structural differences. Even better if you make structural differences from lesion patients, then you really know exactly where the lesions are, so you can start to make some fascinating inferences, causal inferences. One of the best studies out there that are looking at structural differences is by Italian team, Ugesi and his fellows. They studied mystical. It was still on a scale, okay, a scale of mysticism, and they looked at how patients that needed neurosurgery scored on the scale before and after surgery. So they could. That is pretty robust evidence. They changed their way. They became more inclined to believe in transcendental or have in transcendental experiences because they had a surgery in a particular place of the brain. That is convincing, but that's so unique. It's a very rare study. Now, the weaknesses is typically there's a lack of theoretical precision. We don't. The studies were not designed to study religion. It's just a scale that came in there by some incidents. So we don't know exactly what to look for. We are just interested in structural differences. And we know human creativity when it's like that. We go on a hunt for interesting stories. And if there is a structural difference that relates to a religiosity scale, we are all on it. So we will immediately look for interesting stories about that. For example, like what Lisa Miller does in her presentation, very nice, big study with structural differences, and she finds that religious people have a higher cortical thickness. And we don't know exactly what to do with that. We discussed it this morning. To my knowledge, cortical thickness is not particularly good for an average person. It's true that over time, with age, we have a systematic cortical thinning. But in normal development and learning paradigms, in fact, what you want is a relatively thin cortex for doing purposes, because it means that your cortex is functioning very efficiently. So often you see in learning paradigms that if you start to process something new, your cortex will become thicker in the areas involved in the task. But then as you start to master it, it becomes thinner again, because now you don't need a surplus of resources to that area. So we really don't know. Maybe Lisa Miller is right. I am not going to say that she's not right. I'm just saying we don't know. To make a story like that is, to me, something that more seems to an ambition to promote a particular idea. So there are problems, a poor link between structural differences and behavior in healthy subjects. That's exactly what I just talked about, right? We don't know what these structural differences will do to our behavior. We can make conjectures. Just say that they are conjectures if you do. Now, the third approach is this interesting. I'm very fascinated with this. It's to study religion indirectly. By putting participants into situations where they have experiences that somehow may overlap with what we hear when people report religious experiences. This is Olaf Blanke, who he has done a lot of interesting studies. This is a study where he induced by a lot of gadgets. He induces an experience, an out-of-body experiences with cameras and virtual experiences in the scanner to see what's going on when people have an out-of-body experience. Highly creative paradigms. They use kind of standardized experimental procedures, but they are open to study the experience. So we can finally start to look at experience, maybe not directly. And why do we want to avoid studying religious experience directly? Well, for many good reasons. And one is ethical, right? Do we really need to go in and have people have religious experiences? There might be an ethical problem there. But it's a very nice way. The way it's being done is just to say, let's study an aspect of experience that might relate to religion. One of the weaknesses is a lack of religiously meaningful experiences. So typically, when we have an out-of-body experience framed in religion, it's not just a basic sensation that we leave our bodies. It can be, associated with ideas about near death and going to heaven or whatever. There will always be a very rich religious framework for doing your for interpreting your experience into it. You don't have it here in these experiments because they're just basic sense perceptual experiences. And then and that's unfortunate, but that's just how it is. When you start to study complex experiences, you lose experimental control. We don't know how to interpret the data anymore, because the brain functions that we see on the imaging, they are complex. What exactly is causing temporal parietal junction activity when people are lying in a scanner with a very weird setup? We have no idea. It could be just from being in the scanner and being exposed to a strange paradigm. So as soon as we want to study experience, it becomes very difficult to know exactly how to make the interpretation of the blobs that we see on our statistical maps. And so the fourth approach is the ambition that I'm myself most intrigued by, is to say, let's invite religious people in, ask them how they can have an authentic experience. And then if they say, well, I can have I can pray to God on my bike, on my way to work, in the bus. I can pray to God whenever you want me to pray, because I pray all the time. I have no trouble praying in the scanner. And I liked Andrew Newberg's idea that you pray in the scanner because you're so nervous. It's not ethically, I don't know if it's so good, but it makes a lot of sense. Some religious practices you're probably able to induce in a kind of authentic, or have study in an authentic way in a scanner. Others, you will not be able to do that. But if you can, at least there's a prospect here to see what is going on in the brain when people have a religious interaction, religious thoughts, religious practices, whatever. So suddenly the strength is obvious, right? You have a meaningful experience, and you have a very high quality of cultural specificity. Typically, you want to interact with your participants and help them and say, well, we can make this change. Maybe you need preparation time, whatever it takes. So you really adapt your paradigm. You don't just take an experimental paradigm that has been validated 1,000 times. You make a context where the authenticity is possible. Clear strength, but it just destroys a lot, right? Because then you cannot generalize your results to anyone except for the ones that you've been studying. And there's a complete lack of experimental control because they're doing so many things. Often a prayer, how long do you need to study a prayer? Well, I will give you 20 seconds of prayer, and then hope for the fact that what I see on the images will reflect the religious aspects and not something else. But as soon as you work with epochs in your experimental paradigms that last minutes, for example, in Andrew Newberg's studies, his epochs are 5, 6, 7 minutes. I don't remember, but in that area. And how can you sustain a religious thought for 5 minutes? How can you? I mean, I invite you to close your eyes and think about a yellow flower for as long as you can. And if you do, you will realize that you can think about a yellow flower for 10 seconds, and you start to think about other things. It's not so easy. So when you study 5 minutes of religious activity, who knows what people are doing? And we just don't have the experimental control there. That means that when the images are processed, you need to rely on interpretation. And how can we interpret blobs that pop up on the screen? Well, the way you do that typically is to look at previous research and see what other kinds of activities activate these areas. That's called reverse inference. So in my case, I found activity in a bunch of areas that is together typically found in social cognition. When people relate, try to understand other people's intentions, these areas are active. So my interpretation was, praying to God, what do you want of me, God? You know? So I can say maybe praying is characterized by interacting with a person that you God. What you see here is that's the blobs, and here you see the effect size of these areas that are encircled in white, and you can see in personal praying there's more activity, which is why you see this map. We contrasted praying to God with making wishes to Santa Claus. And it sounds unserious, but that's how you do it. When you do functional brain imaging, you need to contrast your religious target condition with something. In the 90s, you just used rest, relax, pray, relax, pray, and then see what is the difference. But the problem with the rest state is that sometimes the participants are just rehearsing for the next task. We don't know what they're doing. They might also think about other things. So you want to control the other condition as well. So rest is not so good because people are free to do whatever they like. So our logic in this study was to say, well, praying to God is a speech act. So we need a contrast that is also a speech act. Praying to God is to an invisible entity that nobody has really seen. We need, in the contrast, to have another entity that people can talk to that they have not seen. So the logic is, so making wishes to Santa Claus is not, I think it was kind of a good contrast because it's very close in terms of cognitive tasks for the brain. The only difference was that these highly Christian Danes, they did not believe in Santa Claus, and they believed in God. And the reason why we see this contrast, now that we made this careful contrast between similar conditions, might exactly be that they are somehow thinking about social stuff and communicating with God. Who knows? I have another suggestion now. It's 15 years ago or 16 years ago. I will talk about that in a moment. But the important thing here is that if you do it like this, it's very nice. It has high authenticity, but it's very bad because there's no experimental control. Sorry. Yes, my God, I could go on. The fifth, I'm not going to talk about it so much. I'm just saying that there are people out there who are capable of inducing amazing experiences that are very close to many religious experiences, just by showing people the power of neuroscience. And Amir As, he made people believe that their minds were being read easily just by saying that we have a new device. Persinger, whose helmet we have used as well in our lab, is a very nice gadget just to say, you know, there's a researcher who says that we can induce a sensed presence in your brain by stimulating with this helmet. And then when you do it, people have a felt presence. So you can start to study the phenomenon in a very direct way. Kind of cool. Ethically, let's discuss it. So let me just put this here. So if let's take away the structural imaging because it's kind of different. But we have a trade-off always when we do this kind of research. Either we go for high authenticity. That's nice, but we lose experimental control, and vice versa. You cannot get both, unfortunately. So there's no best way of doing this kind of research. It's just how it is. You need to decide on what the research question is, and then try to figure out what the best method is. And then we have the beast, reverse inference. Here you don't need to rely on earlier experiments because you have full control of whatever you're studying. But when you study prayer or other authentic experiences, whatever comes out on your brain map is completely up to you to find a good interpretation. And that's why you have a very high degree of reverse inference where you rely on earlier studies. And that can be a major problem. I think we should try to stop this blobology, naive blobology, you could call it, where you just look at the blobs and say, "Ooh, this is Beauregard and Paquette's famous studies on nuns, and they just explore what nuns, Carmelite nuns, when they think about a union with God, what happens in the brain, and they see, look, they have this and that compared to rest baseline. It's a resting state, right? And then they say, oh, this blob has been associated with love, so maybe this is the love aspect. This aspect has been revolved around something spatial, so maybe this is about this aspect of mystical experience. It's completely free. There's no. It's a problem, and the problem is because even if you put a dead fish into the scanner and you give it social stimuli, negative faces or positive faces, you will see differences. If you don't correct your data for all the comparisons, there's a massive problem because you take so many tests in this. So you need to do all sorts of things that are not always being done. For example, this study, there's no correction. It's just somehow like the dead fish. We don't know if it's just magnetic variance in the scanner. Because there's no control, it's completely reliant on reverse inference. I will skip this. The reason why we are so fascinated with blobology is because we don't have a framework for understanding it other ways. And for those of you who attended my talk, I'm happy with a new framework that uses hierarchical Bayesian understanding of the brain. And I think now we are looking into, we don't need this, sorry. We are looking into a time where we need to interpret a lot of data, including my own prayer study. We now have a much better model of generally how the brain is organized, so we can start to maybe interpret a bit and not rely too much on reverse inference. This is my last slide. I'm so sorry for taking too much time. I will just say my point is that there is a trade-off here. Always, no matter what you do, either you lose one and you get the other, authenticity or experimental control. But it doesn't mean that some of the, well, it exactly means that all approaches are equally valuable depending on what you want to study. I believe please be careful when you hear Andrew Newberg, and his research is fine. When you hear Lisa Miller and when you listen to me, just be careful, because there's a lot of interpretation going on here. Often the hypothesis testing is not exactly what you normally associate with hypothesis testing. And I believe that there's an age coming of hierarchical Bayesian integration that makes it that will make our interpretations better. Also because we have more advanced analytical strategies now. And that's it. Thank you.